Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show all about the College of Arts and Sciences. Today I'm joined by Dr. Bonnie O'Neill, a professor in the Department of English, who is an expert in American literature, and I wanted to have her on the show to talk about American poetry in honor of National Poetry Month coming up in April. So Dr. O'Neill, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sam. I'm so excited to be here and talk about poetry.
Me too. I think we are both lovers of poetry, and I'm very excited about this conversation. But before we get into it, I was hoping you could just introduce yourself and tell me about your academic journey.
My academic journey. Well, again, I'm Bonnie O'Neill. I'm in the English department where I teach American literature prior to 1900. So that's early American literature and 19th century U.S. literature. My research specialty is 19th century American literature, and I'm especially interested in the ways that literature engages with public life, and so that would include things like social reform, politics, celebrity for sure, ideas of authorship. Prior to coming here, I was for several years at Wake Forest University, and I did my graduate work at Washington University in St. Louis.
Great. Yes, and I've taken some classes with you, and so I knew that you're an expert in American literature and sort of this cultural aspect of literature. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to have you on today to talk about specifically about Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, and through this conversation explore, what even is the point of poetry and something like National Poetry Month. And so could you tell us a bit about that legacy of theirs as well as the differences of their work? Yeah.
I mean, Whitman and Dickinson are perfect figures to talk about for National Poetry Month for a few reasons. One, just because they're so tremendously influential, both of them. They really have, just in themselves, their poetry is so important. And also the legacies that both of them and their poetry left really set up and continue to influence modern poetry today. And that's very evident as you just kind of keep reading forward from either of those poets into first modern poetry and now contemporary poetry. But another reason they're great for National Poetry Month is that they both really resonate in different ways with public life. And that, to me, is one of the things that National Poetry Month is really important for, is to bring poetry into the public life in a way that maybe we have kind of lost track of. At the time when both of these poets were working, poetry was really more central to public life. It was constantly present in newspapers and magazines in ways that we just don't necessarily see anymore. And so there's a kind of public orientation toward poetry in the 19th century that just makes it really a useful kind of entry point into National Poetry Month, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And like you were saying, so famous. I think everyone who studied American literature have heard these names before. But yeah, they really could not be any more different as far as the writing. So could you talk a bit about this? Like, what does their work look like?
Sure. So Whitman is a maximalist, let's say. He is very famous, among other things, for innovating free verse, so breaking away from the very strict poetic structures and forms that by the 1850s, when he really emerged as a poet, had kind of gone a little stale. People weren't as committed to that anymore, and he absolutely kind of broke with it and is known for working in free verse with these very long poetic lines, creating new ways of structuring poetry through things like the catalogs, where he kind of piles up, if you will, these sort of long sort of lists of objects or people or things that he observes in the world. Instead of using traditional meter and rhyme, he uses things like cadence and repetition of all kinds to give shape to the lines, and that's just so different. Dickinson works on a much smaller scale, and her verses, but I don't want to call it minimalist in the way that he's a maximalist, because she's so compact and manages to kind of condense into a very short lyrics an awful lot through the ways that she actually uses form. She doesn't abandon form in the same way that Whitman does. Instead, her form would be very recognizable, for instance, to anybody who knows the hymn structure. And she uses rhyme, she uses regularized meter, but she pushes against those through things like slant rhyme and her famous dashes, which kind of can lengthen the feel of a line. And so there's form, but she makes it, instead of something that is containing, it's really elastic for her. And then within that, through the ways that she uses language to really resonate across as many meanings as possible that a word choice would allow for, creates this just very rich and, again, kind of condensed lyricism.
Definitely. When I read Walt Whitman, I am just like overwhelmed by his imagination, and that's like the feeling he gets across. He just keeps listing things, and it really feels like his imagination is boundless. And then when you read Dickinson, it's like what she doesn't say, she's thought about it, and it's so potent and condensed. And so she's thought about everything she's written, and there's something that you've got to unpack with it. So very interesting that they're so different, but really, rose to fame through that work. And so they're very different images of what a poet is. And like you were just saying, Leaves of Grass is this very bold proclamation about democracy and self, whereas Emily Dickinson's poems are very reflective and intimate, and she mostly hid them.
Correct.
So could you just talk about that, and what does that say about their perspective in regards to poetry and the public and private sphere?
So again, I'll start with Whitman, who had a very strong idea about poetry as a mode of public expression, that poetry is the way to, he sees poetry as really intricately connected to democracy itself, that and that he tries to enact through his poetry, using it as a way to both represent and maybe generate union and connection with other people. It's really important to remember when both of these folks were writing. Again, Leaves of Grass comes out in 1855, so the right at the height of sectionalism, leading up to the Civil War and writing through that very difficult period, the 1850s, 1860s, into the 1870s. Dickinson is also writing at the same time, so they are both really conscious of all of these political divisions, social divisions, and all of the ways that people are cut off from one another politically as well as personally. For Whitman, poetry can resolve that, and he does so by projecting a persona, a version of the poetic self. It is Whitman. He names himself in some of the poetry, but it's also a vehicle for connection with others. And he's especially interested in connecting with those who are left out, who are downtrodden, who are oppressed, either through their political circumstances, their social class, their lifestyle, sexuality, the work that they do in the economy or don't do, right? Their gender, their race, all kinds of different things that are outside of sort of the mainstream of American political access. And he uses the poetic self as a means of bringing attention to those who have been left out. They're just as important as the president, right? As other people of social and political prominence. And in fact, you have to have their voices. He says that he gives voice to the voiceless. And that's essential in terms of like having a real democracy where everybody is represented.
Right.
Dickinson is not doing that. Like and one reason is that she is one of the people who's left out. She is a woman in 19th century America. She does not have full citizenship. She doesn't have a lot of opportunities or access to the public sphere if that were something that she wanted. And instead, she does something that's radical in its own way, which is to turn in. And if you think about the idea that the reason women are excluded from public life is in part because there is this long-standing philosophical association of women as lacking in a self, right? And her poetry, in fact, turns its full attention to the self, to exploring it with as much depth and attention and everything that goes along with that, right? Pain, desire, concerns for power, right? all of that, even just exploration of the natural world through the senses, all of that is about knowing the self in a way that is, at least in a sort of an official way, kind of not understood as being woman's prerogative.
Right.
And through that, claiming a kind of power, even though it also is a strategic retreat from public life. She only published a handful of poems in her lifetime, and like you said, most of them were discovered after she died. Other people in her circle knew that she wrote, but they didn't know the extent.
Mm-hmm. So both very revolutionary in their own way. I mean, Whitman in this public way, but then, yeah, Emily Dickinson, who as a woman is sort of confined to that public or private sphere, and is fighting against those preconceptions of what a woman is at the time, as far as the way she can contemplate and use reason in her work. So yeah, so interesting and yet so different. And some of that comes from, I believe, Walt Whitman had worked in like the news before.
Correct.
And then Emily Dickinson is a woman at that time. So kind of where they were forced to be, or I think Walt Whitman had this understanding of writing in the public sphere and how it can influence things, and so he's writing in that public way. So interesting. We've got a minute or two left. I would love just to bring this full circle. We've talked about these poets. How do they each in their own way embody what National Poetry Month is all about?
So I think when we think about poetry at this moment in our society and culture, there's a tendency, and I see this with my students, for example, when I talk about this with them, to think of poetry as being a niche activity, right? Either to produce it or to read it is a very kind of rarefied thing that not everybody does. And National Poetry Month is interested, as I understand it, in bringing public attention to poetry, a celebration of poetry, and bring more people into the activity of poetry. As I said at the beginning, I think that these two figures are perfect for that because, again, they come out of a culture that has a really strong understanding of poetry having public significance. For Whitman, that is like programmatic. It's something that he's deliberately pursuing. And for both of them, their legacy is one that is very strongly in the public eye in terms of the influence that they've had. Everybody who encounters them finds something there.
Right.
And so I hope that our viewers, if they haven't yet, will take a look because it's so worth it. And you don't have to be a professor to love this poetry. It's just right there for you.
I think so, and my favorite thing about poetry is you might not think that you like it until you read that one poem. And then I think it just opens the whole world up to you. So please go read some poetry for National Poetry Month. Dr. O'Neill, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, it was fun. Appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Vision. We'll see you next time.